Hello. So for our first Michigan AI Spotlight, I am chatting with Madeline Endres, who is a fourth year, I believe going on fifth year PhD student and candidate in computer science, working with Wesley Weimer at Michigan. She's a recipient of the prestigious and sought after NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, and her research explores creativity, communication, and cognition in software engineering with a focus on human factors. And I'll go on. It's a big year for her research. She has four papers appearing in 2022 venues, including her first author work, Hashing It Out, a survey of programmers' cannabis usage, perception, and motivation in the 2022 International Conference on Software Engineering. And you may recognize her as one of your GSIs because she's assisted in teaching and designing computer science courses for around 8 years, I believe, at the University of Michigan. So hi, Madeline. I'm curious, what made you decide to go for your PhD?
Yeah, so in undergrad here, I TA'd for a lot of different courses and I fell in love with it. It was something that I absolutely wanted to do every day as far as I could see. And I talked to some of the other instructors and they're like, oh, you should get a PhD. And I'm like, oh, I guess I have to get a PhD. And so I applied to PhD programs, ended up accepting the Michigan offer, and then found out I really like research too. So now I'm torn.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess I think you've already hinted at this, but what do you want to do after your PhD at this point? How are you leaning?
My current plan is to stay in academia and probably try and do R1 professor, but it's still a little bit up in the air.
Hmm, hmm.
Mhm.
Great, great. And how far along are you in your PhD at this point?
So I'm finishing my fourth year, going into my fifth, and I'm probably going to do 6 years.
Nice, nice. So
Mhm.
you're pretty close then. Pretty close to being done.
Yeah, scarily close.
That's how I feel too. It's like
Yeah.
yeah, in theory, in our field, PhDs take 5 to 6 years, and I think
Mhm.
I'm in the same year as you, and feeling like
Mhm.
there's a lot more work to do before I'm actually at that point of graduating and
Exactly.
defending and all of that. So that's a lot. Good luck with that. But yeah, so I guess we can talk a little bit more in detail about all your different research. I think
Mhm.
for the Michigan AI audience, there might be some sort of interesting things to hear about that maybe we don't usually spend time thinking about. So I noticed a lot of your work deals with helping novices in programming. In fact, I kind of relate to this topic a little bit because in my lab, the SLED lab, we're called, every time we help our advisor, Joyce Chai, teach a course, we end up spending a lot of time thinking about how can we help beginners to our course material, which is in like natural language processing and AI research. How can we help them understand the sort of hands-on programming behind it? Because it's really a little bit different than the typical like programming that a lot of our students are used to. They often have to learn some new technologies like PyTorch and TensorFlow and might struggle to pick them up if it's their first time dealing with them in our course. And then, of course, we're we're kind of like trying to teach them to sort of interface with research technologies, and they often will end up reproducing some existing results and then run into frustration. So it's like I'm really curious to hear about sort of what have you done along this line of helping programming novices.
So that's an excellent question. We haven't touched so much on the AI area, but
Mhm.
my work has been kind of in two camps. One has been looking more at intelligent tutoring system adjacent work. So this would be like automatically generating hints for buggy programs or automatically like fixing a patch showing maybe, is this what you meant to put as the input of your program instead of this? But then the
Mhm.
other side of it is actually almost looking at interventions that we can do with students. So one focus of my research has been on spatial reasoning. And spatial reasoning is the ability to mentally manipulate objects. It's something that is partly genetic, but a lot of it's actually environmental. Like what toys did you play with a child? What sort of language did you use? And it's correlated with both gender. Men typically have higher spatial reasoning and also socioeconomic status, but it's also something that's causally related to STEM achievement or math achievement or programming achievement. And so doing some work looking into what sort of cognitive interventions can help students who maybe had less preparation coming into computing succeed.
That is super interesting. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've seen some blurbs about the latter part of your work on Twitter before, because this definitely sounds a little bit familiar. So congratulations on that. I really hope that we can really help those who need a little bit of an extra push to get into computer science and STEM. And also on the former thing you mentioned with help with debugging code, I personally would really love to have such a technology. There have been entire days, I'm sure other people can relate, entire days that I've spent trying to solve like a single bug. So
haven't we all?
Yeah, that's an experience that's pretty common across computer science, I would think. So that's super important work, super helpful for our field, I think. And then, yeah, so that's awesome. I think there's also another angle of your work where you've looked at the relationship between programming and mind-altering substances. I know a lot of us have seen posters to recruit people for your studies around the Beister building, right? So I'm really curious just to hear your spiel on that work. It seems like you also have a paper that just came out or is coming out very soon about it.
So this is a more recent branch of work, but it kind of started just based off of my own curiosity. I started looking online and there's a bunch of basically anecdotal wars over different things, like this affects me this way, this affects me this way. But then there's also the intersection of like, how does this impact company policy, or how does it impact developers' well-being at companies? And so that was what I really wanted to investigate. The paper that you're referring to was just published at the International Conference of Software Engineering this past May. And this is a survey looking specifically at developers' cannabis usage, if they use it, and if so, why do they use it, the motivations for using it, their experiences while using it. Yeah, we emailed a bunch of different developers on GitHub, as well as some current and recent students at Michigan, and we ended up getting over 800 responses, and so did some analysis of that.
Wow, that is, yeah, that's super interesting. It's I think when you do research on this sort of underexplored topic, there's just so many things you can find out. And
some of the follow-up work that I'm doing to that right now, which is in progress, for it's the interview study that you might have seen posters for everywhere. We've heard some really interesting things, so I'm looking forward to the analysis, especially like thoughts on how productivity interfaces with creativity and how people use substances, but then the taboo around those substances and how certain things in software community seem to be more accepted than others, or potentially more accepted than even outside of the software community. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, we'll be looking forward to seeing more about that. Yeah, so then I guess I noticed some of your research also revolves around the connections between natural language and software engineering, or at least your research interest, right? And I'm an NLP, natural language processing person. So I guess I'm curious, has your research ever come to lean on any AI techniques, if at all?
Yeah, so I guess three sort of answers. The first one is I tried with my first project, I tried to use some NLP techniques. My first project was automatically generating inputs for buggy programs. It's like hints for students. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe there's a way that I could auto-generate those using NLP techniques. And the answer is probably yes, but I wasn't good enough to do it. So I ended up not going that route and going more of a search space or evolutionary computing sort of route, which is a different thing. But so the answer is I wanted to. And kind of an adjacent side, a lot of my interests between natural language and programming actually come from more the cognitive side. So I've done work looking at how, say, reading prose compares to reading code in novices' brains. And there's kind of a developing theory in CS that when you're more novice in programming, your cognitive like patterns look more like spatial sort of stuff. And as you become more of an expert, it looks more and more like reading. My understanding is this might actually align with a broader sort of theory, which is not 100% known, but more broad, that expertise itself just ends up looking like reading in the brain. But this is an area that I've been going because if you can see like what expertise looks like, maybe there's ways to teach or to help people get to that expertise faster. So that's one of those areas that I do. So, and then I've also collaborated with people who use ML techniques in some of my work. A really good team out of San Diego. There's a PhD student there who I've been on a few of his papers. I do mostly his human evaluations, but he uses large neural networks for program analysis sort of things.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm really curious to follow your work and also other work around this idea of how when we're learning new skills, they become more and more like just reading, just some kind of everyday, I guess, task. Because we often talked about in our lab, like, what is the difference between learning, new language, learning new reasoning capabilities from just language, like reading them in like a textbook versus actually having to learn them from some kind of hands-on, interactive setting. And which ways work better, under what conditions can we start to actually learn skills just from reading language? There's a lot of actual philosophical arguments around language models, which are trained on, tons and tons of text from the internet. Can they actually learn reasoning skills only from that, or does there need to be some kind of hands-on, interactive, more spatial aspect to it? So I could definitely kind of relate to some degree to this broader idea that you mentioned.
No, it's a really fascinating idea. It's definitely, there's so much that we don't understand about the brain in general, but how different processes combine into more complex sort of things like understanding. And I think what you're talking about in your lab is also super cool. So yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, also, I do wonder if you were to do your study on debugging hints today, you'd probably have maybe, I guess I don't know when you did that study, but now it's like we have GitHub Copilot and stuff like that that's powered by language models. Surely we could also have something similar to help us debug code. Sounds
absolutely. Like
yeah,
GitHub Copilot is, I've been playing around with it recently. It's wild. Yeah, really wild.
Another angle that I wanted to talk about, which is very relevant to us in AI, is a lot of your research involves human subjects. Surely this requires a lot of coordination with like our IRB at Michigan. And in AI, I think, well, a lot of our research kind of deals with trying to replicate and understand and, the intelligence and the capabilities of humans. Some of us don't actually spend enough time trying to understand actual humans and incorporating them into our research from the beginning. So I guess I'd love to talk a little bit more about, how do we do human subjects research? What sort of work does it take to make that happen? So for those who may not know, could you talk a little bit more about what are IRBs for? And, what is the kind of research that needs an IRB approval, especially when it comes to computer science?
That's an excellent question. So the IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and it's basically a university's ethics board. So historically, there have been times where research has done things which by today's standards, and probably even by the standards of the time, are not ethical. Some of the ones you may have heard of are I believe the Milgram experiment, a few other ones like Tuskegee Airmen, that one really is rough. So IRBs are basically a way to help make sure that the research that you're doing follows ethical guidelines. And it's a process that you'll have to submit to for any sort of research that you're dealing with human subjects. So if you're interacting with or having an intervention with human subjects, or if you're using secondary data from something that would have needed an IRB. So if you're using like secondary biospecimens, or one that I'm doing right now is if you have data that's governed by FERPA, which is the Federal Protection for Education stuff, you often have to do in there, or HIPAA, things like that. You don't have to do an IRB if it's observing public data. There's a whole list on the IRB's website of things that you don't have to do, but generally my advice would be, if you aren't sure, one, ask the IRB, two, submit it anyways, because what they'll just tell you is like, this is not regulated as human subjects research, and then you don't have to worry about it. So if you're in doubt, just do an IRB.
I would definitely agree with that advice. Our lab has slowly figured out how to interface with the IRB, and that is really the best policy. Is if you're
Mhm,
not sure, ask them. The people there are super nice and helpful, and
mhm.
it's literally their job to help you figure out,
Yeah.
can you do this research? What type of approval do you need, and so on.
At one
And
point, I had like 4 or 5 IRBs in flight, and I kept emailing our liaison, Lee Morrow, who's fantastic. And at one point, I was like, I'm sorry, asking so many questions. She's like, no, don't apologize. I'm here. This is why I'm here. So
mhm.
yeah, definitely do that.
One thing I'm also curious about, to hear your thoughts on is in AI, a lot of our data comes from human annotators on like crowdsourcing platforms such as like
Mhm.
Amazon Mechanical Turk. And scientists in the field have often implied that this is sort of a gray area with IRBs. I'm not so sure if that's true. So, under what circumstances do you think that this type of data collection could require an IRB?
You should do an IRB for Amazon Turk things. It will probably be exempt, but it is way better to do it just because this is one of the things like getting a retroactive IRB, not good. So just
Yeah.
do it. I have had IRB stuff with Amazon Turk go through and it got the exempt sort of certification. And this is great because when you get this, they're like, as long as you don't do any drastic changes, you're exempt. We don't have to do any further review. But when you're going through the exempt process, it's not just like a stamp. They still say like, oh, you need to do this so it can be exempt, or you need to make sure that you're protecting privacy in this way so it can be exempt. So you should really do that process. For Amazon Turk in particular, the main IRB thing that I think I came up with or came across was I had to exclude participants from Europe because of the right to privacy laws in Europe. Those didn't align with certain things. So that was something they brought up to me that I hadn't known. So you should always go through IRB.
Yeah, that's a super good
Mhm,
point, and that's something that I think a lot of us probably don't know. I think a
mhm.
good summary also from that is the IRB will literally take any application for any research you do. So don't ever
Mhm.
feel like, this I don't want to
Yeah.
waste their time. This doesn't need an IRB. If there are other humans involved,
Yeah.
get your IRB approval, submit an application. I always love to hear from researchers about, how did you discover your research interests and find your niche or your multiple niches?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I am definitely the type of person that gets interested in a lot of things, which can make focusing a little bit hard. So there's both a
Mhm.
blessing and a curse of having a lot of different directions. Focus can be really nice, uh, but also, yeah, it keeps it interesting. I don't know, pros and cons. For me, when I came in, I was really thinking I liked programming languages more than I actually do, because in undergrad, I helped develop a programming languages course. I really wanted to help novices. And so that was something from my teaching background that was also coming in. And some of this I also so for my first project in my lab, my advisor was like, okay, we want to do something that's manageable for a first project, something that you can get done in the first year. We can get submitted, get accepted, and that will really like make you feel secure, get through quals. And so the first project was just that. It was something that was to some extent my idea, but was really guided by the advisor. And then after that, my advisor's like, well, you can now do multiple projects. And what do you
Mhm.
want to do? And my advisor is really, really good about letting us go the directions that we're interested in. Having that support allowed my unfocusedness to come out through my research too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there's like a spectrum of PhD students or maybe just researchers
Mhm.
in general, right? There's people who maybe struggle more with finding ideas. They do really well with close management, right? They
Mhm.
need someone to kind of give them a trajectory, at least when they're starting out, right?
Mhm.
And then there's people who, on the other extreme, which is maybe more like you, who have all these really great ideas, but need help kind of focusing. I feel like I lean toward the first extreme, or at least I have in the past, and I'm slowly
Mhm.
moving toward the other extreme. Maybe that's sort of the pipeline.
I think it's also
Um,
just a natural sort of progression because like when I came in here, I didn't have all of the ideas that I ended up working on. What I did over my first couple of years is I just kept a journal of like all of the random ideas that just like went through my mind in the middle of the night. I would just write them down. And I was
mhm,
re-looking at that, and I now have actually done a bunch of them. But anything that you think that's cool, like your first couple of years, even if it's just like a passing thought, write it down because when you think things are cool, you can look back at this in a few years and be like, actually, yeah, that's still really cool. But now I know kind of how to approach that or those sorts of things. So the first year I came in not knowing if I could do research because I didn't have research experience and was very lucky to have an advisor that really helped you go through that initial research process. But then once you have that under your belt, having an advisor that will support you exploring in the way you want to go is really helpful.
mhm, mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I guess if I'm an incoming or a prospective grad
Mhm.
student who doesn't have many research ideas, right? I
Mhm.
shouldn't panic. I just need to
Yeah.
find the right advisor, is kind of what you're saying. Um,
Advisor fit is the most important thing about success in grad school. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are coming in, but having an advisor that you feel like you can talk to about whatever's coming up or you mesh well is much better than like how close you are in quote unquote research interests because research interests can change and or you can look into co-advising. Having someone that you can use as a springboard or sounding board, not a springboard, is really, really important.
yes, yes, I definitely agree. And I would add that you should not be afraid to try to find out everything you can in this respect when you're applying to grad schools. Reach
Mhm.
out to prospective advisors, students, ask them very candid, or
Mhm.
maybe that's the word, questions to get their honest opinions. They have no reason to be dishonest with you.
Yeah. Get their honest opinions when the advisor is not in the room and
Yes,
ask those
yes.
same questions to the advisor.
Yeah, definitely very important to sort of figure out if you're, what is your working style and is that going to mesh with your prospective advisor, and ask
Mhm.
anyone you can about that.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid, don't be shy,
And one thing
but be
also is
respectful, of course.
coming into grad school, you may have a general idea about what you want to do, and maybe that isn't what you end up doing, but it also may be that you go a completely different direction. Don't be afraid to let research interests evolve over time and try new things.
And I think that's kind of what the PhD is for, right? We're learning how to be scientists. We're finding our interests. It's a good time to sort of experiment and figure that out.
PhDs
Um,
are awesome, but they're a lot of work, and so be easy on yourself whenever you can.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You also may end up with a lot of ideas that don't pan out and so on. So
Oh, you will.
that's very common, right? So don't
Yeah.
feel bad if you are doing this sort of moving around, like with your sort of your research focus.
Yes, though I will add to that. Try your best to figure out if something is going to fail early. You won't
Uh-huh.
always be able to do that, right? But I'll go back to like the NLP side of things. I think if I'd spent a long time on it, I might have made it being able to work. But my advisor told me, okay, you're going to have these 2 weeks to try and get like this done. And if you can't do this, we're going to try a different approach. And so having like a timeline on an idea to see if this is the one that's going to pan out is also really helpful because you can get stuck in cycles being like, oh, well, that didn't work, but if I just do this, like it might work, and it just can go on and on. And so trying to add structures to your exploration can help it feel less like you're hitting your head against a wall.
That is a
Mhm.
great point.
If you don't work out, if your first project doesn't work out, you're still going to be, it's okay. Like, don't worry about it. Like a lot of it is still
hmm
luck because a lot of these venues have 15% acceptance rates, right? Like you could submit, but let's say your papers are going to get rejected probably at least 1 out of 3. And one thing my advisor always says is that there's two sort of students, let's say that they're identically good students. One student gets their first paper in, but the next 2 are rejected. And another student gets their first 2 rejected and their third one in. The thing is that second student probably isn't even going to keep going through the program because they're going to be like, oh, I can't do research. This didn't work. And so I think one thing to realize from that is it's not all about when you get acceptances or when you don't, but the process of it and trying to set yourself up for succeeding as best as you can.
I think the last topic I wanted to ask you about, which is something that's very sought after in the grad student world, is you've made a huge accomplishment, right, in being awarded the NSF Graduate Fellowship. And a PSA for anyone who is watching and considering applying for this fellowship. Madeline, I noticed, did post her submitted statements on her personal website. So if you need a good example of someone who got it, you can look at her website. I know a lot of other people have also posted very helpful stuff about this online. I personally never applied for this fellowship. I'm sad to admit, just because, like I have mentioned, I felt like I struggled a lot to find a clear research direction when I started grad school. And it feels like when you're applying for that fellowship, you need to have that, or at least you have to have some clear idea. But I, had no research experience like you, and I think I struggled maybe a bit more to find my footing. But yeah, so I guess I'm curious, when in your grad school career did you apply for the fellowship?
So you can apply for it 3 different times. Once last year of undergrad, once first year of grad school, and then the second year of grad school. And I applied the third of those times. So the second year of grad school time. That was the only time that I actually had prior research to talk about. And yeah.
What does it take to get this fellowship?
Well, it does take a lot of luck. I'm going to put that out there. A lot of people apply for this, and many of them are qualified for it, more than there is room to grant. So applying and not getting it doesn't mean you're not qualified for it. So there is a dosing of luck on all of this. But the things that I think that helped me get into that pool where luck comes into effect, where one, I was very focused in my personal statement. So this is not about the research itself. This is actually the personal statement, which I think is the stronger of my two, where I talked about my music background, which is, I think, something that helped me stand out. And I used that to connect to 3 different skills that I thought were important for research. And so I think having just a really coherent sort of essay is really helpful. And I think another thing that also helped me, which is also dumb luck, is my first paper got accepted before I submitted the proposal, which really it really helps, especially if you're a second year. If you have a couple of papers that are published, that helps. If you're applying right out of undergrad, you don't need any papers. But it does help if you do have one, but it's not a necessary condition if you're applying as a first or second year.
That's all good advice. And also, separate note, there are all kinds of other fellowships that are available for grad students. So definitely block out time, like at least once a semester, to look at what kind of fellowships am I eligible for. There's plenty affinity group based fellowships. There's things that are based on what area you come from, your nationality, your religion. There's tons of funding opportunities to look into. And of course, this, don't panic if you don't have a fellowship. You're probably going to be supported through some kind of research assistantship or teaching assistantship if all else fails. So you're always having some funding, and I feel like at least our department is pretty good on guaranteeing that for us, as far as I know.
Yeah, you don't really have to worry about funding here at all. That's definitely true. And that's a really good point that you brought up for NSF. Specifically, there are a lot of people that aren't eligible, whether you're beyond your second year in your PhD, or there's citizenship requirements, or it might be permanent resident. I don't know exactly what that is, but there are other fellowships which you probably will be eligible for. So taking that time to look them up, or asking your advisor about it. Are there any fellowships that I should apply for? Those are really, really helpful things to do, and good things to do.
Right. I think you've already given so much helpful advice for possible prospective grad students. What is your biggest advice for incoming or prospective grad students? Anyone who's sort of thinking about grad school at this time?
My biggest piece of advice would be focus on research as much as you can. There is a temptation to be like, okay, I have to get through these first couple of years of classes, and then I can really dive into the research. I'm just going to get all the classes done. No. Take the easiest classes you can. Talk to other students in the department. Be like, what is the easiest classes I can do to get my requirements through? And focus in on research, because if you can get some sort of project done in your first year and a half, and get through quals, once you're through quals, they can't kick you out. It's great. The stress goes off. It's excellent. You feel so much more confident having some research under your belt. feel like you can keep going, yeah, always default to research over classes, always. Grades don't matter as long as you pass in grad school.
Yes, I wanted to add that as well, as grades do not matter as much as you might think they do. A lot of very smart people apply for grad school and come in thinking that grades are very important. It's research, or research is everything.
For
If you
PhD
even,
specifically.
yeah, for sure.
Find classes that involve mostly paper reading.
And I'd say when it comes to classes, like a lot of our so-called special topics classes, like EECS 498, I want to say, those can be really good courses for that sort of thing.
Yes.
They'll focus on different sorts of research topics a lot of the time. They might still count for your breadth or depth requirements, depending on the specific section. And yeah, there's often a lot of paper reading I found. So definitely look through those. Don't think that they're just not applicable because they're special topics.
One of the classes that I took was 598 special topics, and it was fantastic. It was computing education research methods. Fantastic class. So yes, do that. Highly concur.
Great. So yeah, I guess we're coming to the end here. So is there anything that you want to promote or plug, maybe that I haven't already?
If you're interested in hearing about, I guess, future studies that I'm recruiting for, you can follow me on Twitter. I feel so weird saying this, but my Twitter is Cello Corgi, CELLO CORGI. So yeah, I'll post updates on research and then also if I'm recruiting for anything. So
great. Thank you so much, Madeline. This is a great talk. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.